Alright, welcome to this Crayon Lecture, and today we're going to talk a little bit about how to plan for animation. The first thing, it seems kind of obvious, is that we want to determine what our aspect ratio is for our film screen, right? And so an aspect ratio really is just the dimensions of height to width of a rectangle. And for our purposes, we're going to use 1920 by 1080, and that's 1920 pixels wide by 1080 high, and that's an HD resolution. But there are many different aspect ratios, and it's important to know, even though it just seems like a simple rectangle, what aspect ratio we're planning for as a primary consideration before doing any animation. So the next thing we do after we figure out the aspect ratio is we determine the path of action. And it's good to do this before we do any animating because the path can easily be adjusted if we don't like it. So if I lay down how I want my ball to bounce, whoops, I can determine its placement through the frame. And if I wanted to make this a little bit higher, I can, or lower, make some adjustments here. I can do that before animating, because remember, animating takes a lot of work and a lot of time, so if we can get everything planned out in advance, then we cut down on the amount of time and work necessary. Now here I'm just going to put in a little bit of floor, just give it a little ground where our ball will be. Now, we're animating this going from screen left to screen right, and I used to have a teacher who would say, sing the piece. And what does that mean? We go, oh, animation! Oh man, I can't believe how corny that was. No, we don't do that, but we can. We sing kind of the sound effect of the movement, and what the sound effect of the movement gives us is a timing. We can do that with a watch, right? So how do you sing an animation? You go, if it's a bouncing ball, you go, doing, doing, doing. And we have to get over ourselves because this is kind of goofy stuff. So then we could do that once we determine what the timing is that we like. We can look at a watch and go doing, doing, doing. So I think about a second and a half. So 1.5 seconds times 24 frames per second is how many frames? Well, obviously 24 plus half of 24 is 12. That's 36 frames. And that 36 frames gives us the 1.5 seconds that we have. So then, once we determine the timing, we know a couple things. We know that, let me get a different color here. We know that frame 1 is going to be about here, and frame number 36 will be here. And this is pose-to-pose animation, and it gives us our keyframe poses. And then what we have to do is determine where the numbers 18 are, like the halfway point, which probably wouldn't be right in the halfway because things would diminish a little bit, or would it? And then we have to make those decisions. Part of your job is to determine how to get the ball on there, and I'm not going to give you all those answers, but remember, when we're dealing with physics, we're going to have this positioning of the ball getting progressively further apart as it picks up velocity, and then as it hits ground, it will be kind of fast, but then it will slow down as it reaches the top of that arc, and then progressively further again apart, and so on. Because if they're all spaced evenly, remember, you're going to get kind of this, but we want doing, doing, doing. We want it to hang up here a little bit longer, so we'll space the drawings closer together. Remember that we talked about squash and stretch, so we could put impact drawings here. We would squash at these areas, and when it's traveling at a very fast speed, it might be stretching into that squash. Now there are a number of different techniques for doing squash and stretch in this position. Some animators prefer to make a relationship that's something like this, where the ball that's just about to impact is stretched, and then it squashes, and then there's kind of an overlap on that next one. So it kind of comes that way and then retains shape pretty quickly. Remember that the ball has to maintain volume, so we're not looking for a flat, we're not looking for, you know, a kidney bean. We're looking for the maintaining of volume, so we're not going to gain any extra mass in these balls, even though we are changing their shape by using squash and stretch. So your assignment is to animate a bouncing ball going from left to right, just like we described, in 36 drawings, 36 frames. And I want you to give it as much elasticity. Remember the 12 principles: bounce, squash and stretch, watch the arcs, watch the spacing, give it some acceleration and deceleration, and see if you can get it as natural as possible. First, you want to make a new file and adjust the stage size, going to Modify, Document, and we're going to use that 1920 by 1080 format, and also make sure that it's 24 frames per second for now. We might play with these a little bit later on for different reasons, but for now we'll keep it in that HD TV format. Next, what we want to do is create a little ball, and I put some tutorials in Canvas on how to create something in there. You can just use the oval tool, and you can color it any way you like. And move it around, and we're going to just mimic what we did. By hitting F6, you can copy the information from one frame, and here we see a keyframe at frame 1. We hit F6, we copy that exact information in frame 2, and then just slide the ball at frame 2 over a little bit. And we keep doing that, as we move the ball through that arc, just hitting F6 and moving the ball, F6, move the ball, and so on. It's a very fast way to just take an object through the screen. Once we get through the whole 36 balls that we're going to be animating, we can then just test it by hitting the return key and see how our sequence is. Now, very often in animation, we have to do a lot of iterative processing, so we have to change things and fix things, and we can find the onion skin and the edit multiple frames. It might be in a different place in yours, but you can find it somewhere on the timeline. It's usually 2 squares. And then just go through and modify the arc, modify the spacing of the drawings as needed, so that you get more pleasing movement, if you like. And you don't need to mimic mine. I think mine, I can already see some issues with it, but that's part of the job of your homework, is to get the ball bouncing the way your eye feels it works well. So watch it through a couple times, look for any kind of hiccups or any hitches, or make sure your arcs are pretty good. You can also scrub through the timeline and with your player head and isolate different frames. The Q key will allow you to free transform, so to create that squash and stretch, you can use the Q key and modify the shape. Remember that the ball needs to maintain its volume, its mass, but it can squash and stretch, and you can change its shape a little bit. You can also toggle between frames by using the greater than and less than keys, which is very useful for checking 2 frames in relation to one another. And it might just take a little bit of time. Animation is just a process of working through things. There are no fast shortcuts really that are worthwhile, in my opinion. It's just a matter of getting in there and testing it and looking at it. And we're going to get the squash and the stretch poses in here. We want that squash and stretch to follow that arc of action. And once we get that going, so we might make a little more adjustment here. Then again, we can press the Command return key, and it might be different on a PC keyboard, and then we can sort of export a test movie. This isn't a movie that we're going to publish yet, we're just testing it. But again, if you hit that return key or the enter key, depending on your keyboard, you can just test the flow of the movement.